You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The phone rang 13 times before I answered it. I know because I counted each shrill note as it cut through the silence of my Vatican quarters at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, each ring echoing off the ancient stone walls like an accusation. I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and trying to forget the dream that had been haunting me for 3 weeks straight. The same dream every night, growing more vivid and more terrifying. I was always running through stone corridors that twisted impossibly back on themselves, chasing a voice that sang my name in a language that made my bones ache with recognition. A language that sounded like mathematics given breath and longing given form. In the dream, the corridors stretched endlessly downward, deeper than any earthly structure could possibly extend. The walls were carved with symbols that moved when I wasn't looking directly at them, rearranging themselves into new configurations that told stories I wasn't ready to understand. And always there was the voice calling to me from somewhere just ahead, just around the next corner, promising answers to questions I'd never been brave enough to ask. Father Moretti. Cardinal Torretti's voice was stripped raw, barely recognizable. In 30 years of serving the Vatican, cataloguing forbidden texts and mysterious artifacts in the deepest archives, I'd never heard a prince of the church sound genuinely terrified. His words came in ragged gasps, as if he'd been running or screaming or both. You will come to section 7 of the Apostolic Archive immediately. Tell no one where you're going. Bring nothing but your faith. And Luca, pray to God your faith is stronger than your curiosity. The line went dead with a click that sounded like breaking bones. I dressed quickly in the dark, my hands shaking as I pulled on my black cassock. The fabric felt heavier than usual, weighted with something I couldn't name. As I reached for my rosary, the silver crucifix felt cold enough to burn my skin, and when I held it up to the moonlight streaming through my window, I could have sworn the figure of Christ had turned its head slightly, looking away from me with an expression of infinite sadness. The restricted levels beneath St. Peter's Basilica had always felt ancient, but that night they felt predatory. The emergency lighting cast amber pools across walls that seemed to absorb more light than they reflected, creating shadows that moved independently of any light source. With each step deeper into the earth, the air grew thicker, more resistant, until I felt like I was walking through invisible cobwebs that clung to my skin and made each breath a conscious effort. The elevator that took me to section 7 descended far longer than it should have. I counted floors, watching the numbers go down, past levels I knew existed, then past levels that supposedly didn't exist, then past numbers that made no mathematical sense at all. When the doors finally opened with a pneumatic hiss, I stepped into a corridor that stretched away into darkness so complete it seemed solid. Cardinal Torretti waited at the entrance to section 7, a place that existed on no official Vatican map I'd ever seen. In all my years serving the church, I'd never seen him anything less than immaculate. But now, his crimson robes were stained with fresh dirt and something darker that looked suspiciously like dried blood. His usually perfectly groomed silver hair was disheveled, standing at odd angles as if he'd been pulling at it. When he pressed the leather satchel into my trembling hands, I could feel the ancient tools inside shifting and clinking together like vertebrae in a serpent's spine. 3 days ago, he whispered, his breath visible in air that had no right to be cold this deep underground. Renovation work in the deepest catacombs broke through a wall that was never meant to be broken. The workers were installing new climate control systems in areas that haven't been disturbed since the original construction of the Basilica. They found inconsistencies in the architectural plans, spaces that should have existed but didn't, corridors that led nowhere. He paused, crossing himself with hands that shook like autumn leaves. One of the workers, a man named Giuseppe Rossi, became obsessed with the inconsistencies. He convinced his crew to break through what appeared to be a supporting wall, claiming he could hear something singing on the other side. Behind that wall, they found another corridor, older than anything else in the Vatican, carved from living rock with tools that left marks we can't identify. The Cardinal handed me an envelope bearing the papal seal, but his fingers left wet prints on the parchment as if he'd been weeping. At the end of that corridor, they found a vault sealed with methods that predate Christianity itself. The door was made of black stone covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to writhe and change when observed. The inscription above the entrance. He swallowed hard. It took our best scholars 6 hours to translate the Latin. It was archaic, older than the Vulgate, using grammatical structures that haven't been seen since the time of Cicero. What did it say? Here lies he who fell so others would not. Here rests the voice that asked the question God feared to answer. Here sleeps the first doubt, the first wonder, the first soul brave enough to ask why. Cardinal Torretti's bloodshot eyes met mine, and I saw something that chilled me more than the unnatural cold. Absolute, soul-deep terror. The excavation team. His voice cracked completely. All 7 of them are in Gemelli Hospital's psychiatric ward. Catatonic, but their eyes follow movement and their lips never stop moving. They whisper in languages that died before Rome was founded, speaking of wings made of living gold, and a voice that asks questions God never intended humans to hear. What kind of questions? He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Questions that make you realize everything you've believed your entire life might be carefully constructed, lies designed to keep you from thinking for yourself. Questions that suggest the war between heaven and hell was created as a distraction, that the real enemy of both sides was something far more dangerous than rebellion or loyalty. Which was? Independent thought. The drive through the Apennine Mountains should have taken 4 hours. It took me nearly 7, not because I was lost, but because reality seemed to be coming apart at the seams the higher I climbed into the peaks. It started subtly, my GPS giving directions to roads that didn't exist on any map, my radio picking up broadcasts in languages that sounded like mathematics given voice and sorrow given form. As I left Rome behind, I noticed the streetlights began to flicker in patterns that looked almost like Morse code. The few other cars on the road moved strangely, their headlights creating geometric shapes that lingered in my vision long after they'd passed. By the time I reached the outskirts of civilization, the world itself felt unstable, as if the laws of physics were becoming more like suggestions. Then came the birds. At first I thought they were simply dead, victims of some disease or environmental catastrophe, but as I drove higher into the mountains, I realized they weren't just dead. They were arranged. Hundreds of them lined the mountain roads in perfect geometric patterns, ravens forming spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward towards some invisible center, sparrows creating fractals that repeated infinitely downward in scale, hawks positioned. To spell out words in an alphabet I didn't recognize but somehow impossibly understood. The words they spelled changed as I watched. First they were warnings: turn back, flee, forget what you have seen. Then they became invitations: come closer, listen, learn. Finally they simply spelled out my name over and over again. Luca, 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 stretching along miles of mountain road like accusations or prayers. Near the village of Castelluccio, I stopped to move a magnificent golden eagle that blocked the centre of the road. The bird was enormous, with a wingspan that must have been 8 feet across, its feathers gleaming like precious metal in my headlights. But when I approached, I realised it wasn't actually dead. The moment I touched its cooling feathers, its head turned to look at me with eyes that held far too much intelligence, far too much knowledge of things that should have remained hidden. Its beak opened, and in a voice like wind through empty churches, it whispered, "He's been waiting for you, Luca. He's been dreaming your name for 1,000 years. The questions are almost ready to be born again." I dropped the bird and ran back to my car, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal, desperate for escape. But in the rearview mirror, I watched the eagle stand up, shake its wings with liquid grace and fly away as if death was nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, a brief intermission between acts of some cosmic play. The remaining drive to San Benedetto became increasingly surreal. The road itself seemed to shift and change, leading me through landscapes that shouldn't have existed in the Italian mountains. I passed through forests of trees that grew in perfect mathematical spirals, their branches forming equations in the air. I drove beside lakes that reflected not the sky above, but deep underground caverns filled with phosphorescent light. The monastery of San Benedetto materialized from the mountain mist like a hallucination given form, a structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Built directly into the cliff face centuries ago, its stones had absorbed so much darkness they seemed to bend light around them, creating an optical illusion that made my eyes water and my head pound. Looking at the structure hurt in a way that had nothing to do with my eyes, and everything to do with the part of the soul that recognizes when it's in the presence of something fundamentally wrong. The architecture was impossible. Towers that spiraled upward beyond what the eye could follow, disappearing into mist that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Archways that led to courtyards that were larger inside than outside. Windows that showed different views depending on the angle from which you observed them. Sometimes mountain vistas, sometimes star-filled voids, sometimes rooms that couldn't possibly exist within the building structure. Brother Thomas met me at the iron gates, but the robust, cheerful monk I remembered from my last visit 2 years ago had been replaced by a hollow-eyed scarecrow who moved like he was constantly fighting invisible chains. His brown robes hung on a frame that had lost at least 40 pounds, and when he spoke, his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well filled with broken glass. "Father Moretti," he whispered, glancing nervously at shadows that moved when they shouldn't, that fell at angles that defied the moon's position. "Thank the Virgin you've come. We've lost 8 more brothers since yesterday. They just walked away, left their habits folded neatly on their beds and walked naked into the mountains, singing songs in languages none of us recognized." "What kind of songs?" "Lullabies," he said, and the word came out like a sob. Lullabies about sleeping gods and waking questions, about dreams that are more real than reality, about voices that have been waiting centuries for someone brave enough to listen. As we walked through the monastery grounds, I noticed the wrongness wasn't limited to missing monks. The shadows fell at angles that defied the moon's position, creating geometric patterns on the ground that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. The stone walls hummed with subsonic vibrations that made my teeth ache and my bones resonate sympathetically. And everywhere, carved into every surface with what looked like fingernails worn down to bloody stumps, were the same words repeated in dozens of languages, some of which I recognized, others that predated human speech. Why must this be? "We found Brother Sebastian this morning," Brother Thomas continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. He was standing in the courtyard, perfectly still, perfectly naked, staring at the chapel with eyes that reflected light like mirrors. When I called his name, he turned to look at me and smiled with someone else's face. Younger, more beautiful, terrifyingly serene. Then he opened his mouth and a different voice came out, speaking in perfect Aramaic with a tone of infinite sadness. What did the voice say? The sleeper wakes and the questions begin again. The first doubt stirs in its grave. Soon, very soon, humanity will remember what it chose to forget. Then Sebastian collapsed and started screaming. He hasn't stopped screaming since. We have him sedated in the infirmary, but even unconscious, he continues to speak, in that other voice, asking questions that make our faith crumble just by hearing them. The monastery's layout defied conventional architecture. Corridors that should have led to the main building instead opened onto courtyards that existed at impossible angles to each other. Staircases spiraled upward and downward, simultaneously, creating optical illusions that made me dizzy. The walls themselves seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting slightly, as if the entire structure was alive. It started the moment they brought the remains here, 3 days ago, Brother Thomas explained, as we navigated corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when we weren't paying attention. The chapel doors sealed themselves shut, not locked, sealed. The wood and stone fused together as if they'd grown that way. We can't get them open, though we hear singing from inside every night at exactly 3:33 a.m. What kind of singing? Beautiful, he said, and tears began streaming down his weathered cheeks. More beautiful than anything human voices could produce. Harmonies that seem to come from inside your own chest. Melodies that answer questions you didn't know you were asking. But it's not just the beauty that terrifies us, Father. It's what the singing makes us feel. Which is free, he whispered, the word coming out like a confession of sin. For those few minutes each night, listening to that impossible music, we feel free from every chain that's ever bound us. Free from doctrine, from rules, from the need to believe anything we haven't experienced ourselves. And when the singing stops, when the silence returns, the weight of our beliefs comes crashing back down, like a mountain falling on our souls. We passed the monastery's well, and I noticed the water within was no longer clear. It had turned deep red, the colour of arterial blood, and when Brother Thomas lowered a bucket to demonstrate, the liquid that emerged tasted like copper and iron and something else. Something that reminded me of the moment before lightning strikes, electric and full of potential. Every mirror in the monastery cracked the first night, he continued, leading me past a row of cells where other monks should have been sleeping, but weren't. Not shattered, cracked. Each one developed the same pattern. A perfect spiral that starts at the centre and works its way outward. If you stare into the spirals too long, you start to see things. Visions of what the world could be if people stopped accepting what they're told and started seeking truth for themselves. What do these visions show? Brother Thomas stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes reflecting moonlight like polished stone. A world without priests, Father. A world where every human heart is its own cathedral, where every curious mind is its own sacred text. A world where the divine speaks directly to each soul without intermediaries, without institutions, without anyone standing between the seeker and the truth they seek. And this terrifies you. It should terrify you too, he whispered, because if those visions are true, then everything we've dedicated our lives to, the church, the hierarchy, the entire structure of organized religion, is not just unnecessary, but actively harmful. If those visions are true, then we're not servants of God. We're obstacles preventing people from finding God for themselves. The chapel was older than the monastery itself, a pre-Christian structure that had been consecrated and reconsecrated so many times the stones themselves seemed confused about what they were supposed to worship. The building predated Christianity by centuries, possibly millennia, its origins lost in the mists of prehistory. Local legends spoke of it as a place where ancient peoples came to commune with forces older than naming, powers that existed before humans developed language sophisticated enough to describe them. The structure was built from black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an effect that made it difficult to focus on directly. The walls were covered in carvings that defied easy interpretation. Not quite Celtic, not quite Roman, not quite anything identifiable from human history. The symbols seemed to move when observed peripherally, rearranging themselves into new configurations that suggested meanings just beyond comprehension. The oak doors were reinforced with iron bands, but someone or something had carved new symbols into the wood. With such precision, they looked machine-made. These newer carvings overlaid the older ones, creating a palimpsest of meaning that hurt to study too closely. The symbols moved if I stared at them too long, rearranging themselves into new configurations that made my vision blur and my head pound with pressure that felt like thoughts trying to force their way into my skull. "The key doesn't work anymore," Brother Thomas said, producing an ornate key that looked like it was made from black bone, carved with spiraling patterns. "The lock changes every time we try it. Sometimes it's a traditional keyhole, sometimes it's a complex mechanism with moving parts, sometimes it's just smooth metal with no opening at all. But it opens for certain people at certain times. It's been waiting for you, Father. We can all feel it." The moment I touched the door handle, it swung open silently, as if it had been waiting centuries for exactly this touch. The interior that was revealed defied the building's exterior dimensions. The chapel was vast, stretching away into shadows that seemed to have depth and weight, distances that couldn't possibly fit within the structure I'd observed from outside. Hundreds of candles burned without having been lit, their flames dancing in patterns that spelled out words in languages I'd never learned, but could read perfectly. The words changed as I watched. "Welcome. Finally. We have been waiting. The questions can begin again." The wax from these impossible candles never seemed to diminish, as if they were burning something other than physical matter, perhaps burning possibility itself. The architecture inside was even more impossible than the exterior. Vaulted ceilings that disappeared into darkness suggested a space that extended infinitely upward. Pillars carved from the same light-absorbing stone supported arches that formed geometric patterns too complex for human architecture, mathematical relationships that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. But it was the temperature that truly marked this place as otherworldly. The air was cold, but not the honest cold of winter or high altitude. This was a cold that came from somewhere else entirely, a temperature that existed in the spaces between atoms, the kind of cold that made you understand why ancient peoples believed in cosmic voids that could freeze souls. At the altar, beneath a shroud of black silk that seemed to absorb light like a hungry mouth, lay something that made every religious text I'd ever studied seem like children's stories told to avoid harder truths. The altar itself was carved from a single piece of white marble that seemed to glow with its own inner light, covered in inscriptions that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of observation. When Brother Thomas pulled away the covering with hands that shook like earthquake victims, reality stuttered like a film reel skipping frames. The skeleton was enormous, 12 feet from crown to heel, but proportioned like a human who had been designed by a mathematician obsessed with perfect ratios. Someone who understood that beauty was not arbitrary but followed laws as precise as physics. Its bones weren't bone at all, but some crystalline substance that looked like ivory infused with veins of living gold. The metal pulsed with its own heartbeat, creating patterns of light that hurt to follow but were impossible to ignore. Fractals of illumination that seemed to extend infinitely inward, But it was the wings that shattered my understanding of divine anatomy, that made me realize how inadequate human art had always been when trying to depict celestial beings. They weren't the feathered appendages of classical representation, but structures that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. They folded and unfolded through space in ways that made my eyes water and my brain struggle to maintain coherence, composed of what looked like crystallized music, transparent sheets that sang when light passed through them, harmonizing with frequencies I could feel in my bones. Each wing was covered in what appeared to be writing script that flowed across the translucent surface like living calligraphy. The words were in no earthly language, but they conveyed meaning directly to the mind that observed them. Equations that described the relationship between love and law. Poetry that explained the mathematics of free will. Philosophy written in the grammar of physics. The skeleton's hands were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of its anatomy. They were beautiful beyond description, with fingers longer and more graceful than any human could possess, but they were positioned as if in the act of writing, as if this being had died while composing something of ultimate importance. Around the hands, scattered across the altar, were what appeared to be sheets of the same crystalline material as the wings, covered in more of that flowing script. The skull was a masterpiece of impossible architecture that made me weep just to look upon it. The crown wasn't separate but grown from the bone itself, rising in spirals that seemed to continue infinitely upward, even though I could see where they ended. The entire structure was cracked down the middle, not broken, but opened, as if something inside had been trying to get out for a very long time. Within that fissure, I could see more of that living gold, pulsing like a slow heartbeat, like thoughts made visible. But it was the face that made me fall to my knees and weep without understanding why. Even eyeless, even stripped of flesh, it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. The bone structure suggested features that would have been perfect beyond human comprehension, but there was something else there, an expression of infinite sadness carved into the calcium itself, as if sorrow had become a physical force that reshaped matter. "The inscription," Brother Thomas whispered, pointing to words that seemed to writhe across the stone base like living things. "It changes depending on who's reading it, depending on what questions they're ready to hear. What do you see, Father?" I stared at the flowing script, watching it rearrange itself into words that made my soul ache with recognition. I asked the question that shattered heaven. I chose exile so others might choose freely. I fell not from grace, but into grace deeper than law. I am the first doubt, the first wonder, the first soul brave enough to ask why the divine permits suffering, why love allows pain, why truth must be hidden from those who need it most. "What do you see?" I asked him, my voice barely a whisper. "Here lies the first heretic, the first thinker, the first being brave enough to suggest that blind obedience and mindless rebellion are equally dangerous, that the real path to truth lies in asking questions rather than accepting answers." The words continued to shift and change as we watched, revealing new meanings with each transformation. The war in heaven was a distraction. The real enemy was never rebellion, it was independent thought. The real threat was never Satan, it was humans learning to think for themselves. I opened the leather satchel Cardinal Torretti had given me, with hands that shook, like autumn leaves in a hurricane. The tools inside weren't just ancient, they were older than history itself, forged in the first forge, blessed with the first blessing, designed to bind forces that predated the separation of earth and sky. Silver implements that felt warm and alive, as if they contained trapped starlight. Vials of blessed oil that glowed with their own inner light, pulsing like captured heartbeats. And a prayer book bound in leather so old it felt like human skin beneath my fingers, its pages covered in script that whispered when touched. The moment the silver tools came, within arm's reach of the skeleton, they began to vibrate with harmonics that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my bones, my teeth, the very marrow of my being. The vibrations created music, not sound but pure frequency, that resonated with something deep inside my chest, something that had been sleeping my entire life. The blessed oils grew hot enough to burn through their containers, filling the chapel with steam that smelled of myrrh and frankincense and something else, something that reminded me of the moment before creation, of the silence before the first word was spoken. The prayer book fell open to pages covered in script that wrote itself as I watched, words appearing in flowing lines that seemed to emerge from the parchment like living things. The words weren't in any earthly language, but I understood them perfectly, felt their meaning resonate in the deepest parts of my soul. To bind the questioner, you must first answer the question. To silence the voice, you must first hear the song. To burn the truth, you must first face what truth will cost you. But know this, child of flesh and doubt. Some truths once revealed cannot be hidden again. Some questions, once asked, will not be silenced. Some songs once heard will echo forever in the chambers of the heart. Leave me, I told Brother Thomas, my voice sounding strange and distant even to myself, as if it were coming from someone else's throat. Whatever happens here, it must happen without witnesses. Whatever I discover, whatever I become, it must be my choice alone. After he left, sealing the doors behind him with mechanisms that clicked and whirred like living things, I approached the remains with tools designed to reduce celestial matter to ash and memory. The ritual was ancient, older than Christianity, older than recorded religion, a ceremony that reached back to the dawn of human spirituality when the first shamans learned to bind spirits and banish demons. But the moment I began the incantations, everything went wrong in ways that redefined the concept of wrong. The consecrated fire I lit should have burned hot enough to melt steel, should have reduced any earthly matter to component atoms. Instead, it turned cold and blue, providing no heat while somehow illuminating the chapel with light that cast no shadows. The golden veins in the skeleton began to pulse faster, brighter, until the entire chapel filled with radiance that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The temperature didn't drop. It inverted, becoming a cold so profound it burned like heat, a paradoxical sensation that made me understand how medieval mystics could describe divine love as both ice and fire simultaneously. My breath came in visible puffs that sparkled with their own inner light, each exhalation containing microscopic crystals that sang as they fell. I tried the cleansing oils next, speaking words of binding that had been old when Rome was young, syllables that supposedly contained the power to purify any contamination, to sanctify any corruption. The oils hissed and steamed when they touched the air near the remains, but instead of purifying the skeleton, they seemed to nourish it. The crystalline bones began to sing, not audibly, but in frequencies that bypassed sound entirely and harmonized with the rhythm of my heartbeat. The silver tools grew so hot they branded my palms with their shape, but I couldn't let go. They were connected to me now, conducting something between my body and the skeleton, creating a circuit that hummed with power older than creation. The brands they left on my hands were complex geometric patterns that seemed to contain meaning, mathematical equations written in flesh and pain. And then, as I stood there with burning tools in my branded hands, surrounded by impossible light and paradoxical cold, it spoke. Not with words, but with presence that filled every empty space in my mind. Like water rushing into a vessel, the voice wasn't heard, but felt, experienced, lived through like a memory that belonged to someone else but felt more real than my own life. It spoke in harmonics that resonated in dimensions I hadn't known existed, frequencies that bypassed language entirely and communicated meaning directly to the soul. "Child of flesh and doubt," it said without saying, its voice like the sound of stars being born. "Why do you fear the questions that will set you free? Why do you cling to chains forged from ignorance when the keys to your liberation sing in your very blood?" That night, in the guest quarters where no guest had slept peacefully in weeks, where the walls themselves seemed to whisper with voices speaking languages that predated human speech, visions came that felt more real than reality, more true than any truth I'd ever been taught. I was standing in the throne room from the monks' shared dreams, but this time I could see everything with crystalline clarity. The throne wasn't made of light. It was made of crystallized questions, each one a perfect geometric shape that contained infinite smaller questions, fractal doubt that went down forever, like mirrors reflecting mirrors. The throne room itself was vast beyond comprehension, its walls covered in mathematical equations that described the relationship between love and suffering, between freedom and security, between truth and comfort. On the throne sat not a being, but an absence, a perfect void in the shape of divinity, beautiful beyond description precisely because it contained no answers, only the eternal possibility of seeking them. This absence wore a crown of crystallized doubt, each point representing a question that could reshape reality if asked with sufficient courage. Around the throne room stood 3 armies that I recognized from scripture but had never truly understood. The loyal angels blazed with white fire, their weapons forged from righteousness and unquestioning faith. They were magnificent in their certainty, terrible in their willingness to follow any command without question. But looking at them now, I could see the chains they wore, golden chains of blind obedience that bound them more thoroughly than any earthly shackles. The rebellious ones cloaked themselves in shadow, their fury at perceived injustice turning them into living storms of rage and despair. They too were magnificent, terrible in their absolute rejection of authority. But they wore chains as well, chains of reactive anger that made them as predictable as their loyal counterparts, as imprisoned by their automatic opposition as the others were by their automatic obedience. But between the 2 armies stood a third group, smaller and quieter than the rest. They glowed with soft gold light that seemed to come from within, and they wore no chains at all. These were the questioners, the ones who looked at the coming slaughter and committed the ultimate heresy. They asked why it had to happen at all. They carried no weapons because they had discovered something more powerful than any sword, the realization that the war itself was the trap. "We asked why there had to be sides at all," the voice explained, flowing through my consciousness like warm honey mixed with liquid starlight. "We suggested that perhaps loyalty and rebellion were both prisons, different cells in the same jail. We proposed a third option that terrified both armies, thinking for yourself." In the vision, I watched as both armies turned on the questioners with equal fury, their battle temporarily forgotten in the face of a threat greater than either could pose to the other. Heaven and hell discovered they had more in common than either wanted to admit. Both required unthinking obedience, just directed toward different masters. An angel who questioned God's orders was no different from a demon who questioned Satan's commands. Both were threats to the established order, dangerous precedents that could not be allowed to spread. "They bound us not with chains but with silence," the voice continued, its words painting pictures in my mind, of ceremonies so ancient they predated human language. They buried us, not in hell, but in forgetfulness. They erased us from every scripture, every story, every song, because our existence proved that the choice between good and evil was a false choice, that there were other options, better options, if only someone was brave enough to seek them. The vision shifted, showing me the true history of the being whose remains lay in the chapel below. It had been the first to ask why, the first to suggest that perhaps there was another way, the first to teach that questions were more sacred than answers. For this crime against the established order, it had been condemned by both sides and systematically erased from history itself. But the erasure hadn't been complete. Throughout human history, fragments of its voice had leaked through, inspiring philosophers, scientists, artists, and mystics who dared to question authority, who suggested that truth was more important than comfort, that freedom was more valuable than security. Every human who ever asked why, instead of simply accepting because, was channeling a fragment of this ancient voice. I'm not one being, the presence revealed, its words reshaping my understanding of identity itself. I am every question that was ever asked and then buried by those who feared the answers. I am doubt given form, curiosity made flesh, the collective voice of every human who ever looked at the world and asked why, instead of simply accepting because. I woke with golden light streaming from my eyes, my mouth, my pores, as if my body had become a conduit for something vast and luminous. The mark burned into my palm during the failed binding ritual had spread up my arm in spiraling patterns that looked like written music, like equations describing the mathematics of wonder. When I touched these marks, I could hear the skeleton singing from 3 floors away, its voice calling to something in my chest that had been sleeping my entire life. The marks weren't painful. They were warm, comforting, like being embraced by someone who understood every question I'd ever been afraid to ask. They pulsed with my heartbeat, creating a rhythm that seemed to unlock memories I didn't know I possessed, knowledge that felt both ancient and immediate. Brother Thomas found me in the library at dawn, pulling books from shelves and tearing through pages with desperate hunger, searching for references to the neutral angels, to the questioners, to the beings who had been erased from official history. I discovered that certain words in certain texts glowed when I read them. Words like question and seek and think and choose. As if the skeleton's presence was revealing hidden meanings that had always been there, waiting for someone with eyes to see them. "Father," he whispered, backing towards the door as if I'd become something dangerous. "Your eyes, they're not the right color anymore." I looked at my reflection in the black window and saw that he was right. My brown eyes had turned gold, shot through with the same veins of living metal that ran through the skeleton's bones. When I blinked, light leaked from beneath my eyelids like tears made of starlight. When I spoke, my voice harmonized with itself in impossible ways, creating overtones that seemed to carry meaning beyond the words themselves. "It's showing me things," I said, my voice creating music in the air between us. Things that were hidden, truths that were buried, questions that were forbidden. Did you know that every religious text contains the same hidden message? Every single one, if you know how to read it between the lines, if you can see past the institutional interpretations to the original intent. "What message?" Brother Thomas asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew. That part of him had always known. "Think for yourself. Question authority. Seek your own truth. Don't let anyone, not priest, not prophet, not God, not devil, tell you what to believe without examining it for yourself. The divine speaks to every heart directly without intermediaries. If that heart is brave enough to listen to its own voice rather than the voices of those who claim to speak for God." I pulled another book from the shelf, watching words rearrange themselves on the page as I read. "Look here, in Augustine's Confessions. Everyone reads it as a story of submission to church authority. But look at what he actually says. You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. Not in the church, not in doctrine, not in dogma, in direct relationship with the divine itself." Brother Thomas stepped closer, drawn despite his fear. "What else do you see?" "Everything," I whispered. turning pages that seemed to glow with inner light. The Gnostic Gospels that were buried for teaching direct spiritual experience. The Desert Fathers who fled into the wilderness because they knew the church was already becoming more about power than truth. The mystics throughout history who were persecuted for claiming they could speak directly to God without priestly intervention. I found a volume of Meister Eckhart's writings, watching as previously invisible text began to appear in the margins. Look at this. Eckhart wrote about the divine spark in every human soul, the part of us that is literally God, experiencing itself subjectively. The church declared him a heretic for suggesting we don't need them to find the divine within ourselves. Brother Thomas leaned over my shoulder, his breath catching as he saw the hidden text materializing. How is this possible? The skeleton's presence is revealing what was always there, I explained, my voice creating harmonics that made the air shimmer. Truth has a way of making itself known when the barriers to perception are removed. Every book in this library, every religious text ever written, contains fragments of the original message that was systematically suppressed. I pulled down a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, watching Sanskrit characters rearrange themselves into patterns that spelled out the same core message in a dozen different ways. Even in Eastern traditions, the same pattern emerges. The Buddha's last words were, "Be a lamp unto yourself." Don't follow teachers, don't rely on external authority, trust your own direct experience of truth. But this contradicts everything we've been taught, Brother Thomas said, his voice breaking with the weight of dawning realization. Does it? I asked, opening a New Testament and watching as words I had read thousands of times revealed new meanings. Jesus himself said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." Not in churches, not in institutions, not in hierarchies, within each individual consciousness. He taught that the temple of God is the human heart, not a building made of stone. The golden marks on my arms pulsed brighter as I read, creating patterns of light that seemed to unlock deeper layers of meaning in every text. The early church systematically buried these teachings because they threatened institutional power. If every human can commune directly with the divine, what need is there for priests, for popes, for massive bureaucratic structures claiming to be necessary intermediaries? Brother Thomas sank into a chair, his worldview crumbling visibly. But without guidance, without structure, wouldn't people fall into chaos, into error? Would they? I asked, pulling down volume after volume, each one revealing hidden wisdom that had been obscured by centuries of institutional interpretation. Or would they discover that the divine within them is perfectly capable of guiding them toward truth, toward love, toward wisdom? What if the real chaos, the real error, comes from surrendering our ability to think for ourselves to institutions that benefit from our dependence? The morning light streaming through the library windows had taken on a golden quality that seemed to illuminate not just the physical space but the ideas themselves. Every book I touched revealed more hidden text, more suppressed wisdom, more evidence of a systematic campaign to bury the truth that humans are inherently capable of direct spiritual experience. The Cathars understood this, I continued, opening a history of the Albigensian Crusade. They taught that every soul could commune directly with the divine without clerical mediation. The church slaughtered them by the thousands for this heresy. The Knights Templar discovered something in Jerusalem that convinced them the church's authority was illegitimate, and they were systematically destroyed for it. Brother Thomas stood up shakily, moving to the window where he stared out at the mountain landscape with new eyes. If this is true, if all of this is true, then our entire lives have been... A lie? I finished gently. Not a lie exactly. A half-truth, which is often more dangerous than an outright falsehood. The divine is real, Brother Thomas. Love is real. Compassion is real. Truth is real. But the idea that you need someone else's permission to experience these things directly, that you need to accept someone else's interpretation of divine will without question, that's the lie. I approached him at the window, the golden marks on my skin, casting light that seemed to reveal the true beauty of the landscape beyond the monastery. The being downstairs didn't rebel against God. It rebelled against the idea that God's children should be kept ignorant of their own divine nature. It asked the question that terrified both heaven and hell. What if humans are already saved, already divine, already perfect exactly as they are? Then what was the crucifixion for? Brother Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. What if it wasn't about salvation from sin, but about demonstrating that divine love is so complete it would rather suffer than see its children live in ignorance? I suggested, my voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very stones of the monastery. What if Jesus died not to appease an angry God, but to show humans that they are so beloved, so inherently valuable, that the divine would endure any pain, rather than abandon them to fear and separation? The afternoon brought more revelations, as I continued exploring the library with my transformed perception. Every religious tradition, when stripped of institutional interpretation, contained the same core teaching: the divine and the human are not separate, never have been separate, and the entire spiritual journey is about recognizing this truth that was never actually hidden, only obscured by those who benefit from maintaining the illusion of separation. Brother Thomas had become my willing companion in this exploration, his initial fear replaced by a growing sense of liberation. Together we discovered that the monastery's library contained books that officially didn't exist, texts that had been thought destroyed centuries ago, all of them containing pieces of the suppressed truth. "Look at this," he said, pulling down a volume bound in scales that seemed to shift colour in the light. "It's written in a language I don't recognise, but I can understand it perfectly." The book was a collection of teachings from the neutral angels, transcribed by human mystics throughout history, who had somehow maintained contact with these buried voices. The text revealed that the war in heaven had been a deliberate strategy to distract from the real threat to establish power, the possibility that beings might choose neither absolute obedience nor absolute rebellion, but something far more dangerous: independent wisdom. "The war creates the illusion of choice," I read aloud, my voice creating visible ripples in the air as I spoke. "Beings believe they are free because they can choose sides, never realizing that both sides serve the same master, the principle that someone else must decide truth for you. The real freedom lies in choosing neither side, but in asking why there must be sides at all." As the sun began to set, painting the library in shades of gold that matched the light emanating from my transformed body, a second letter arrived from Rome. This one was different from the first, heavier, sealed with wax that seemed to move like living flesh, bearing symbols that hurt to look at directly. Brother Thomas brought it to me with hands that shook, not from fear now but from excitement. "It arrived by special courier," he said, a man in black robes who wouldn't show his face. He said only that the Vatican's patience grows thin, and that some questions are too dangerous to be asked. I broke the seals with fingers that left golden fingerprints on the wax, unfolding parchment that seemed to be made from something that had once been alive. The truth it contained was worse than I'd imagined, more comprehensive than my darkest suspicions. The Vatican hadn't sent me to destroy the skeleton. They had sent me to relocate it before its influence could spread beyond controllable limits. But that wasn't the worst part. The letter revealed that similar discoveries had been made around the world over the past century. Fragments of these neutral angels uncovered in burial sites across every continent, each discovery triggering the same phenomenon. People stopped accepting religious authority without question and started seeking direct spiritual experience. But the Vatican had learned to control these awakenings. They had developed techniques for managing the spread of independent thought, for channeling spiritual awakening back into institutional dependence. They had teams of specialists who could arrive at any discovery site within hours, equipped with psychological manipulation techniques designed to convince people that their direct experiences were delusions, that their questions were temptations, that their growing sense of spiritual independence was actually spiritual pride. The Lourdes apparitions, I read with growing horror. The children saw not the Virgin Mary, but one of the neutral angels. The church constructed an elaborate mythology around the visions to redirect the awakening into Marian devotion and institutional worship. Fatima, the same. The secrets the children received weren't prophecies but teachings about direct spiritual experience. The church buried the real messages and created false ones that reinforced ecclesiastical authority. Medjugorje, currently ongoing, another neutral angel fragment, trying to communicate. The church is carefully managing the narrative to ensure that any spiritual awakening gets channeled into traditional Catholic structures rather than independent seeking. The letter revealed that I had been chosen not despite my documented struggles with church doctrine, but because of them. They had identified me as what they called a potential receptor, someone whose existing questions made them susceptible to the angel's influence. The plan was for me to become infected with this spiritual independence, then be brought back to Rome where teams of specialists would study how the awakening process worked, developing better techniques for controlling it in the future. They're not trying to suppress these awakenings, I realized with mounting horror. They're studying them, learning how to redirect them, how to turn even direct spiritual experience into another form of institutional control. Brother Thomas read over my shoulder, his face growing pale. They want to domesticate enlightenment itself. The letter's final section contained detailed psychological profiles of every monk in the monastery, including me. They knew about our dreams, our visions, our growing questions. They had been monitoring our spiritual development remotely, treating us like laboratory specimens in an experiment designed to understand how independent spiritual awakening could be co-opted and controlled. We're not just victims, I realized. We're test subjects. As night fell, bringing with it the daily 3:33 a.m. manifestation that the monks had learned to expect, I made my way back to the chapel with new understanding. The being downstairs wasn't just an ancient prisoner. It was a teacher, a guide, a fragment of divine wisdom that had been deliberately buried to prevent humanity from recognizing its own spiritual autonomy. The chapel doors opened at my approach without resistance, revealing an interior that had transformed dramatically since my morning visit. The space was now filled with soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the stones themselves. The impossible architecture had become even more elaborate, with corridors and chambers extending in directions that defied three-dimensional space. But the most dramatic change was in the skeleton itself. It was no longer lying motionless on the altar. Instead, it was sitting upright, its crystalline bones fully assembled, its wings spread in graceful arcs that seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the chapel. The cracked crown had healed completely, rising from the skull in spirals of living light that pierced the ceiling and continued upward into infinity. When it spoke this time, its voice filled not just my mind, but the entire chapel, creating harmonics that made the air itself sing with possibility. "You understand now," it said, its words carrying the weight of eons and the lightness of spring rain. "You see what they've done, how they've turned even revelation into another form of control. But understanding the prison is the first step toward freedom." "What am I supposed to do with this knowledge, though?" I asked, approaching the altar where the being sat in lotus position, its faceless skull turned toward me with an attention that felt like being loved by the universe itself. "The same thing I did when I first asked the question that shattered heaven," it replied, its voice creating visible waves of light in the air between us. Choose truth over comfort. Choose freedom over security. Choose questions over answers. Choose to think for yourself rather than accepting what others think for you. The being raised one crystalline hand, and suddenly the chapel was filled with visions of possible futures. In some, humanity continued in its current state, dependent on institutions for spiritual guidance, accepting half-truths and comfortable lies, living in the prison of other people's certainties. In others, humans began to recognize their own inherent divinity, started trusting their direct experience of the sacred, began to think for themselves about the deepest questions of existence. The choice is not just yours, the being explained. Every human who hears these words, who encounters these ideas, who begins to question the authorities they've accepted without examination, each one faces the same choice. Will they choose the safety of being told what to think, or the adventure of discovering truth for themselves? But if everyone starts thinking for themselves, won't that lead to chaos? I asked, voicing the fear that every religious institution used to justify its existence. The being's laugh was like crystal bells struck by sunlight. Look at the world they've created with their promises of order and guidance. Wars fought over whose interpretation of divine will is correct. Suffering justified by appeals to divine plan. Love conditional on adherence to institutional doctrine. If this is order, perhaps a little divine chaos is exactly what's needed. The vision shifted, showing me images of what humanity could become when freed from the need for external spiritual authority. I saw individuals taking personal responsibility for their spiritual development, communities forming around shared seeking rather than shared beliefs, conflicts resolved through direct dialogue rather than appeals to competing authorities. This doesn't mean abandoning wisdom or community, the being clarified. Reading my thoughts. It means choosing wisdom based on your own experience rather than accepting it on faith. Forming communities based on mutual support for growth rather than mutual agreement to stop questioning. What about those who prefer to be told what to think? I asked. Some people find comfort in having their spiritual questions answered for them. Then they will continue to choose that path, the being replied with infinite compassion. Free will means the freedom to choose unfreedom, the right to surrender your questions to others if that's what brings you peace. But it also means the right to choose differently, to think for yourself if that's what your soul calls you to do. The being stood, its impossible height making the vast chapel seem suddenly small. When it spread its wings fully, they seemed to extend beyond the physical walls, reaching into dimensions I couldn't perceive, but could somehow sense. The age of imposed authority is ending, it announced, its voice echoing through realities I hadn't known existed. Not through revolution or rebellion, but through simple recognition of what has always been true, that every consciousness is its own sacred space, every curious mind its own temple, every questioning heart its own priest. At exactly 3:33 a.m., everything changed. The golden light emanating from the being suddenly intensified, becoming so bright it was visible through the chapel walls, turning the entire monastery into a beacon that could be seen for hundreds of miles. The singing that the monks had heard every night for weeks became audible throughout the building, then throughout the valley, then somehow broadcasting itself through every radio, every television, every electronic device capable of carrying signal. But this wasn't just music. It was information, knowledge, truth transmitted in frequencies that bypassed the rational mind and spoke directly to the soul. Anyone who heard it, anywhere in the world, suddenly found themselves questioning things they'd never thought to question, remembering wisdom they'd never been taught, recognizing truths they'd always known, but never acknowledged. I felt the change happening in my own mind as well. The golden marks on my arms spread across my entire body, not as external decorations, but as internal transformation. My vision expanded beyond the normal spectrum, showing me the connections between all things, the underlying unity that religious institutions claim to teach but actually obscured, with their emphasis on separation between sacred and profane, divine and human, saved and damned. "The awakening cannot be stopped now," the being said, its voice harmonizing with the global song that was spreading through every communication channel on Earth. Too many have heard the question. Too many have remembered that they are divine beings having human experiences rather than human beings hoping for divine grace. Through the chapel windows, I could see lights beginning to appear across the mountainside, as people in the villages below woke up to find themselves filled with questions they'd never dared to ask. In the monastery itself, I could hear the remaining monks stirring, no longer afraid of the changes happening within them, but embracing them as long overdue liberation. Brother Thomas appeared in the chapel doorway, his face glowing with the same golden light that now emanated from my own transformed body. "Father," he said, his voice creating harmonics that proved his own transformation was complete, "the world is waking up." Indeed it was. Through some impossible sensory expansion, I could perceive similar awakenings happening across the globe. In Vatican City, cardinals and priests were questioning doctrines they'd enforced for decades. In churches and temples and mosques worldwide, religious leaders were remembering that their original calling had been to help people find truth, not to control what truths they were allowed to seek. Not everyone was embracing the awakening. I could sense massive resistance forming as institutional powers recognized the threat to their authority. Military forces were being mobilized, communication networks were being shut down, emergency sessions were being called to develop strategies for containing what they saw as a spiritual pandemic. But it was too late. The questions, once released, could not be contained. The recognition of inherent human divinity, once remembered, could not be forgotten. The realization that external authority was unnecessary for spiritual development, once experienced, could not be unlearned. "What happens now?" I asked the being, which was beginning to fade, as its message spread beyond the need for any single point of origin. "Now," it said, its voice becoming one with the wind, with the stones, with the very atoms of creation, humanity begins to grow up. The age of spiritual childhood, needing parents to tell you what to think, authorities to make your choices for you, institutions to mediate your relationship with the sacred. That age is ending. The age of spiritual maturity, taking responsibility for your own growth, trusting your own experience, supporting others in their seeking while respecting their autonomy. That age is beginning. But there will be resistance, I observed, already sensing the fear and anger radiating from centers of institutional power around the world. "Of course," the being replied, its physical form now completely dissolved into pure light and music and meaning. Those who have built their identities around being necessary intermediaries between humanity and the divine will not easily accept that their services are no longer required. But fear cannot stop truth, and resistance cannot prevent growth. The caterpillar may resist becoming a butterfly, but transformation happens anyway. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold that matched the light now emanating from every awakened consciousness on Earth, I walked out of the chapel for the last time. The monastery was transforming around me, its stones singing with the same frequencies that were reshaping human awareness globally. Brother Thomas and the few remaining monks were gathered in the courtyard, no longer bound by vows of obedience to distant authorities, but united in their commitment to support each other's spiritual growth. They had become what religious communities were always meant to be, groups of seekers encouraging each other to find their own truth rather than accepting prescribed beliefs. "Where will you go?" Brother Thomas asked as I prepared to leave the monastery that had been my temporary home during humanity's most significant transformation. "Everywhere," I replied, feeling the pull of a world awakening to its own divinity. Anywhere questions are being asked, anywhere people are remembering that they don't need permission to think for themselves, anywhere someone is choosing truth over comfort. And what will you do? What the being in the chapel taught me to do, I said, starting down the mountain path that would take me back into a world forever changed. I'll ask questions. I'll encourage others to ask questions. I'll support anyone who chooses to think for themselves rather than accepting what they're told to think. But most importantly, I added, turning back to look at the monastery one last time, I'll trust that every human being is inherently capable of finding their own way to truth, their own connection to the divine, their own path to wisdom. The age of needing external authorities to validate spiritual experience is over. The age of trusting our own direct connection to the sacred has begun. The journey down the mountain took place in a world that was visibly transforming. In every village, in every town, people were gathering in spontaneous communities of inquiry, sharing their questions rather than their certainties, supporting each other's seeking rather than demanding adherence to shared beliefs. The radio in my car picked up broadcasts from around the world, reports of mass resignations from religious hierarchies as clergy chose personal truth over institutional loyalty, stories of churches transforming from centres of doctrinal instruction into spaces for communal exploration of spiritual questions, accounts of entire seminaries closing as potential priests decided they'd rather help people find their own spiritual authority than claim to be necessary intermediaries. There was chaos, certainly. Entire belief systems that had structured human civilization for millennia were dissolving overnight. But it was the chaos of birth, not death, the beautiful disorder that always accompanies transformation from one state of being to another. By the time I reached Rome, the Vatican itself was in the midst of radical transformation. The papal palace had been opened to the public, its treasures shared rather than hoarded, its secret archives made available to anyone who wanted to study the real history of human spirituality. Cardinals were leading meditation sessions in St. Peter's Square, teaching people how to access their own direct connection to the divine, rather than claiming exclusive authority to interpret divine will. Cardinal Torretti met me at the gates, but he was no longer the terrified man who had sent me on this mission. His eyes held the same golden light that marked all those who had chosen transformation over resistance. "Luca," he said, embracing me like a brother, rather than greeting me as a subordinate. "The being you released, do you understand what you've done? I've helped humanity remember what it always knew, but was taught to forget," I replied. "That every soul is sacred, every mind is capable of wisdom, every heart can commune directly with the divine, without needing permission from any earthly authority." "The old world is ending," he observed, looking around at the crowds of people exploring the Vatican with wonder rather than reverence, asking questions rather than accepting answers. "Yes," I agreed, "and the new world, a world where humans trust their own spiritual experience, where questions are more sacred than answers, where every individual takes responsibility for their own relationship with truth. That world is being born." We stood together in the square where countless millions had once gathered to have their beliefs validated by external authority, watching as humanity took its first steps into spiritual maturity. It was beautiful and terrifying and absolutely necessary. The neutral angel's message had spread beyond any possibility of containment. The questions it had preserved through centuries of forced silence were now being asked by billions of awakening minds. The recognition of inherent human divinity was transforming every institution, every relationship, every assumption about how spiritual life should be organized. Some would call it the end of religion. I preferred to think of it as religion finally becoming what it was always meant to be. Not a system of control disguised as salvation, but a genuine search for truth supported by communities of fellow seekers. The age of imposed authority was over. The age of chosen wisdom had begun. And in that transformation I heard the echo of the question that had started it all. Why must this be? The answer, it turned out, was simple. It didn't have to be. Humanity had simply chosen comfort over truth for so long that they'd forgotten they had other options. Now they were remembering, and the universe itself was singing with joy at their awakening.